Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at the Listening Post. This week, Libya, from the front lines to the back rooms.
They were rebel vehicles.
The pictures, the coverage, and the lobbyists working behind the scenes to keep Arab dictators in power. Justice delayed can be justice denied, but there's progress in the 5-year-old investigation into the murder of a Russian journalist. WikiLeaks says it's under cyber attack, and the site is fighting accusations of a reckless and dangerous release of information. And stop us if you've seen something like this before.
A toast, establishing me as the wealthy, successful protagonist, who is handsome.
Hollywood and the tricks of the trailer-making trade in our web video of the week. When Libyan fighters stormed into Bab al-Azizia, Muammar Gaddafi's abandoned compound, they brought a lot of the world's media with them. In the fight for Libya, the opposition, based in the eastern city of Benghazi, cultivated a close relationship with journalists. Correspondents traveled with rebel fighters. News outlets ran live updates from the battlefield and covered press conferences held by leaders of Libya's National Transitional Council in Doha, Washington, and London. Proximity to the media has helped the NTC control the message. Critics say it's also helped deflect media scrutiny. But with the NTC now taking charge of Libya, the media are having to shift the focus of their reporting onto the men who led the opposition, their political histories, their ties with NATO, and their plans still unclear for the country they now control. Our starting point this week is Tripoli, the power base the Gaddafi family has abandoned for Algeria, and the ongoing coverage of the story they have left behind.
More astonishing scenes from Tripoli as hundreds of rebel fighters rampage through Colonel Gaddafi's compound.
It's absolutely clear that the media is reflecting a Western government's view.
They fought their way right to the heart of Tripoli.
It's characterized very simplistically as goodies versus baddies, and this is a false narrative, actually.
In terms of imagery and messages, the spectrum of message from broadcast news, it's very, very narrow indeed. It is a soundbite journalism.
The Gaddafi regime is the third government to fall to an Arab revolution, but it's the first to be toppled in an all-out civil war. The other thing that set the Libya story apart was the opposition base. By controlling the eastern part of the country and turning Benghazi into their command center, the opposition forces could manage their military and media operations.
The fact that they had their own base, a place where journalists could visit and speak to rebel commanders, meant that those rebel commanders and their media handlers from very near the beginning of this story had a chance to shape the way the story was covered.
Yusuf is a rebel soldier.
Please, come please.
What's different from Syria is that here the journalists were able to speak to the opposition because the opposition had their own base camp.
That allowed the media to characterize what's happening there as more of a civil war than as a struggle or a revolution.
Civil war in Libya.
When you represent something as a civil war, it is as if you give legitimacy to both arguments.
Outright civil war.
And actually that has been the narrative portrayed in much of the Western media.
On the other side of the story, in this particular war, you had Western reporters in Tripoli and on the Gaddafi side, because the Gaddafi regime dealt more intelligently with the media than, for instance, Saddam Hussein's regime during the Iraq War.
Reporters in Tripoli, based at the Rixos Hotel, were carefully controlled by government minders. As the opposition forces closed in on the capital, those minders turned the Press Corps Hotel into a prison.
We're inside this government-controlled hotel.
And even news teams covering opposition fighters sometimes found their room for journalistic maneuver curtailed.
They were rebel vehicles. There certainly have been occasions when I have had problems with the rebel forces and trying to get where I wanted to go. And some of the places where they advanced, there were all sorts of stories of looting. We wanted to get to the bottom of that story. It was difficult for us to do so, and it became even more difficult when a Human Rights Watch story came out talking about abuses by the National Transitional Council's forces. And after that Human Rights Watch report came out, for really a matter of weeks, we found our access to the front line severely limited.
Still, the correspondents covering opposition forces were much freer to report than those in Tripoli. And since they also had compelling combat images to offer, that side of the story was much more visible. However, picture-driven conflict coverage tends to be long on action and short on context.
We heard a lot about the brave liberator, but nobody asked where they came from.
A lot of friends have died with me in the front line.
It was quite clear we were not knowing who the people were, who were going into Tripoli, who was setting themselves up as local militias, what were their motivations, who was commanding them, were they under command of Benghazi and the National Transitional Council, who funded them, where did the guns come from?
And coverage of the NTC itself has been minimal, especially given that until recently many NTC leaders were part of the same regime they were trying to take down.
The way that the media has covered the opposition leaders in Libya is very interesting. Some of those people in the Transitional National Council were linked to the old Gaddafi regime, and that is brushed over to some extent.
The truth here is a large proportion of those that made up the opposition were, before all this started, quite close to the regime. And I think that when you spoke to ordinary Libyans, they would tell you, we don't mind really, as long as they've changed sides, we support them. If they're on our side, we'll back them. So I think we were taking our cue from the ordinary Libyans we spoke to.
The other side of it is some of the more Islamic elements. There's been some focus on the leader of the armed forces that freed Gaddafi's compound in Tripoli, Abdul Hakim Belhaj. And some of the more hostile, the more anti-Muslim elements of the media will start making links to Al-Qaeda and caricaturing that there is a faction in this opposition that is Islamic and there's going to be some kind of blowback.
Rebels claiming they're in control.
Overall, the criticism of the coverage of the war for Libya raises a fundamental question that goes to the core of journalism. Assuming the media were sympathetic to the Libyan opposition, how many of their viewers, their readers, would actually blame them?
The coverage by Western media of the Egyptian uprising was overwhelmingly pro-demonstrators.
The cheering from the square behind me is so loud.
Favorable to the movement. What does it mean? There was some kind of Western agenda? No, it means that there is sympathy in the public opinion for what appears as genuine, popular rebellions against despotic regimes. I mean, why does anyone expect the media, in that case, not to be sympathetic to the rebellion?
Rebels risking their lives for a telegenic, ostensibly democratic revolution will always find favor among journalists. Once they take power, though, once they become the government, the story and the coverage will surely change. Our Global Village voice is now on the coverage of Libya and the fall of Muammar Gaddafi.
I've been quite uncomfortable with the use of the term rebels in the media due to their negative connotations, and after the enormous successes over the past 10 days in Tripoli and the control of the revolutionaries now over the vast majority of the country, I believe that they should be referred to as the legitimate authority of Libya.
We're still unsure of the credentials of the Libyan opposition to bring democracy to Libya. We do know that former army elements from the Gaddafi regime still occupy certain positions in the Libyan NTC. We do know that there are pro-Western elements in there. We do know that there are Islamist elements in there. And we also know there are divisions. But all of this has escaped media scrutiny because we're following the good guy, bad guy narrative.
If you've got an opinion on the news media that you'd like to get on the air as one of our Global Village voices, we suggest you join the thousands of our viewers who already follow us on Facebook and Twitter. They go to those sites to find out what stories we're working on so they can weigh in, or you can just get in touch with us via email at listeningpost@aljazeera.net. We'll have more on the Libyan story in just a few minutes, but it's time now for Listening Post News Bites. The Syrian government has approved changes to the country's media laws, changes that Damascus is playing up despite skepticism on the part of its critics. President Bashar al-Assad has approved reforms that call freedom of expression a constitutional right in Syria, oppose monopolies in the media sector, and scrap prison sentences for media offenses. However, in the fine print, the law also calls for responsible freedom of expression and prohibits any reporting that incites violence or promotes sectarianism, and that leaves plenty of room for legal interpretation. The legislation also restricts journalists from covering the military. The law states that any attack on a journalist will be treated as an attack on a Syrian government official. Those changes were approved just days after one of Syria's most prominent political cartoonists, Ali Ferzat, was reportedly beaten up, allegedly by forces loyal to President Assad. Russian journalists have been waiting more than 5 years for a conviction in the murder of their colleague, Anna Politkovskaya. They've been given hope once again that one may be coming. Dmitry Pavlyuchenkov, a retired senior policeman, has been arrested and charged with plotting Politkovskaya's killing. Investigators in Moscow accuse Pavlyuchenkov of plotting the journalist's murder and assembling the team that carried it out back in 2006. 2 men were acquitted of charges in 2009 due to what was ruled to be a lack of evidence. Earlier this year, Rustam Makhmudov, the alleged triggerman, was arrested while on the run in Chechnya and indicted for the murder. Ms. Politkovskaya worked for the Novaya Gazeta newspaper. She was a staunch critic of the Kremlin and renowned for her investigative reports on Russian human rights abuses during the Chechen War. Her supporters say that's what got her killed. Picking up on a story that we ran back in July, an Ecuadorian journalist has reportedly fled to the United States after being found guilty of libeling the Ecuadorian president. In a letter issued in Miami, Emilio Palacio, who wrote for El Universo, a leading daily in Ecuador, said he feared for his safety from what he calls the dictatorship, and that, quote, one would have to be blind not to understand that they want me behind bars, unquote. Earlier in the year, the journalist wrote an op-ed column that called President Rafael Correa a dictator and alleged that he ordered his supporters to open fire on a hospital during a police mutiny in Quito last year. 10 people were killed. Mr. Palacio and 3 executives at the newspaper were found guilty of libel, each sentenced to 3 years in prison. The journalists were also fined $30 million, the paper another $10 million. The case is currently under appeal. Before fleeing the country, Mr. Palacio released this mobile phone footage, which he says contradicts President Correa's original statement that said he never ordered the military to open fire. The footage allegedly shows the president telling his supporters that the mutineers should be, quote, shot in the chest for treason. Those doing this are traitors to the fatherland, unquote. President Correa rejected the characterization of that footage, saying his words had been altered. WikiLeaks says the whistleblowing website has suffered a cyber attack. That was the message posted on WikiLeaks' Twitter feed after users complained they had difficulty accessing the site. The alleged attack came just a few days after WikiLeaks and its founder, Julian Assange, were criticized for the release of confidential U.S. diplomatic cables said to include the unredacted names of at least 90 U.S. informants and sources who may have been put at risk. According to a report in Germany's Der Spiegel magazine, the document release was unintentional, the result of a long-running feud between Assange and his former WikiLeaks colleague, Daniel Domscheit-Berg, who is no longer with the organization. WikiLeaks played down the alleged leak and tweeted that the current story being spun about wild cables, including from Spiegel, is significantly incorrect. There has been no leak at WikiLeaks, it said. The issue relates to a mainstream media partner and a malicious individual. In the dying hours of the Gaddafi regime, stories emerged in Western media about the former Libyan leader's last-ditch negotiations with NATO. Those negotiations, the stories said, took place through an intermediary, a lobbyist. From the first days of the Arab Spring in Tunisia, Western lobbying and PR companies have been quietly working behind the scenes, contracted by embattled governments to spin coverage in their favor. They're paid a lot of money to do that. Consulting companies like Washington-based Corvus Communications, Brown Lloyd James, headquartered in New York, and London-based Bell Pottinger have been working with governments in Yemen, Syria, and Bahrain. As the bad press has grown worse, business has improved for the PR firms. However, in the process of packaging and managing the messages of troubled governments, lobbyists have found themselves in an unfamiliar and uncomfortable place under the spotlight. The Listening Post's Meenakshi Ravi now on the professional spin doctors from the West working across the Middle East, the counter-revolutionaries of the Arab Spring.
3 days into the uprisings in Bahrain, the police opened fire on demonstrators.
hundreds were injured. But in a press release the next day from Bahrain's PR firm Bell Pottinger, the talk was about the way forward. There wasn't a word about the night before. The press statement was standard issue, a routine part of a daily media management exercise.
In the process of the crackdown, foreign reporters and correspondents who were in Bahrain were directly handled by Bell Pottinger employees who wrote press releases and even prepped Bahraini officials with talking points.
The police would not walk into a neighborhood and start shooting people.
James Duggan, a photojournalist, was in Manama at the height of the demonstrations.
In my own experience, it's very annoying to read a press release describing violence the author did not witness when your own skin is still burning from the tear gas. It only adds insult to injury later when your correspondence account is challenged, or in the case of Reuters, kicked out of the country.
For PR firms, there's been a surge in business from Arab governments this year. Bahrain, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen have all signed on. Even the rebel-led National Transitional Council of Libya is getting professional communications advice. But spinning for Arab governments is hardly a new line of business, just more widely publicized given the Arab Spring. 5 years ago, Boston-based Monitor Group signed with the Gaddafi government to enhance international understanding and appreciation of Libya. The contract called for a fee of $250,000 per month, and some of that money was paid to American academics who were shipped out to Tripoli to meet with Gaddafi.
And when they came back from their trips, most of them ended up writing glowing op-eds and essays that were then placed in prominent publications such as the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New Republic. These articles seem to just push aside Gaddafi's horrific human rights record, his possible sponsorship of various terrorist-related activities around the world, and basically create an impression that Gaddafi was someone that the U.S. could consider dealing with.
More telling than what those academics wrote was what they did not write. Anthony Giddens, Benjamin Barber, Joseph Nye, they all went to Libya as paid consultants for Monitor Group. The articles published with their bylines did not disclose that fact.
I hear from media professionals I talk to is that, look, I'm a journalist and my task is to go find information and get news. But I think that a journalistic responsibility here is to disclose that you were handled by these foreigners who are working for a PR firm. I think that's a minimum of transparency.
Siddhartha Mahanta dug into the PR lobbying world for Mother Jones magazine.
It's very difficult to sit at home and go through all these different publications and start to sort of read between the lines. Only in the process of reporting for our story did we come to see the similarities. They all followed this basic narrative of, I was invited to Libya, I sat down with Gaddafi, had an interesting, eccentric sort of experience, and came home thinking that maybe the notions we had about Gaddafi were wrong.
The vast gulf between reality on the Arab street and the message in the media is what these PR firms get criticized for most. Take New York-based Brown Lloyd James, a media consulting firm whose work for the Syrian government resulted in a Vogue magazine article, a flattering profile of Syrian First Lady Asma al-Assad. The glossy magazine hit the stands just as Syrian security forces were shooting demonstrators.
The images, the styled, glamorous images of First Lady Assad attempted to show how she and her family are not very different from the sort of Western upper or upper middle class family. But when their client is shooting unarmed people in the streets, the integrity of these firms rightly belongs under a microscope.
Brown Lloyd James in Damascus saw a potential PR triumph turn into a disaster. Vogue's journalism was criticized. The magazine scrubbed the article from its website. It disappeared. But for companies like Brown Lloyd James, the ties with governments are tougher to hide, because under American law, all US-based firms must disclose lobbying and consulting work with foreign governments. Anyone can see who's working for what government on www.fara.gov.
Literally everything that has been filed with that office is now accessible, indexed on the web at the fara.gov site. It's like using a library search engine.
When you click on Quick Search, you can search all the various countries that have representation in the United States. You can also search by actual lobbying firms. For example, Monitor Group, you will find the work that they have done for Libya and some work they've done for Jordan. For a curious person who wants to understand the way foreign countries curry influence in this country, it's a terrific resource. There's no doubt about it.
The website is especially useful since none of these firms like to publicize their work. We requested interviews with the Monitor Group, Morris International, and Bell Pottinger. None of them were willing to go on camera with us. Even the Washington Media Group, which terminated its contract with Tunisia's government a week before Ben Ali stepped down, did not want to speak. The firm was one of only 2 companies that ended their contracts when the violence escalated. But it's not as though embattled governments will have to look far for other PR partners.
I don't believe the leaders of these governments need to be worried that they won't be able to find this representation. There will always be someone willing to represent a client, just as there's always a lawyer willing to represent a certain defendant, regardless of what he or she is accused of. And certainly people have perhaps traded their ethics for smaller sums of money.
But I think that's part of the real genius of these PR firms. I think that's why they're paid the big bucks. I think that's why their services continue to be so valuable for foreign leaders around the world. They're very good at what they do.
So the next time you read a flattering article about an otherwise unpopular government, try reading between the lines. That's where the real story may lie.
More Global Village Voices now on Arab governments and the hired help they get from lobbyists.
These contracts are enormous. We're talking about $20,000 to $30,000 a month, more than $1 million over a year. For that kind of money, these regimes will always find people prepared to work for them. What might happen is that the firms, the ad-first publicity means that the firms are less prepared to advertise the fact that they're working for these regimes.
I don't believe it is correct of these PR firms to work with regimes like Hosni Mubarak's or Gaddafi's regime because this is unethical, in fact. They know that those regimes were dictatorship.
Finally, some of you may remember the time a couple of years back we ran a web video of the week on the anatomy of a television news story. It featured cliche after cliche, the reporter's walking piece to camera, the jazzy, explanatory graphic, and those anonymous people on the street you always see when poll results are being reported. Well, feature films have their own cliches, and they come thick and fast in film trailers. When studios squeeze 90 minutes worth of plot and action into a 2-minute sales tool. So this week, we have a little trailer trash for you. The ultimate formulaic film trailer put together at a comedy site called Cracked.com. It's attracted more than 1.1 million hits online. Count the cliches, and we'll see you next time at The Listening Post.
A toast, establishing me as the wealthy, successful protagonist. Who is handsome?
Murmur of agreement.
Friendly concern that something may be missing from your life.
Confidence that nothing is missing in my life.
Interrupted statement about
reassurance that my good fortune will not waver.
Frustration with these new circumstances.
Admiration at your seeming selflessness.
Interest in your bold rejection of social norms as evidenced by your dyed hair.
My name.
My name. Differences are surfacing between us.
Also, I've got to use tough love to help this Latin American teenager believe in himself. Also, I must prove innocent this incredibly humble human male.
Lead females, nay!
Explicitly stating the moral of the story and awkwardly working in the movie title.